Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Memory and Valour, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the individual stories and quiet sacrifices of Canadian veterans. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thank you for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. I wanted to give you just a little bit of background about me, just so you know who you're dealing with here. I've spent nearly 4 decades as an amateur genealogist, tracing family lines and uncovering forgotten stories. Along the way, I eventually became a personal historian and now a university student focusing on Canadian military history. But this mission isn't just academic, it's deeply personal. My great-grandfather, Sapper Alexander Richardson Milburn, was killed in action at the Battle of Hill 70 in France in August 1917. His story, like so many others, reminds me that behind every name on a casualty list was a life lived, a family left behind, and a promise that their memory should endure. That promise is what drives me. I want to ensure that those who served in the Great War are remembered not as statistics, but as individuals with voices, dreams, and sacrifices that shaped our world as Canadians. Through this podcast, I'll share the stories I've uncovered, stories of courage and resilience and sometimes heartbreak, so that together we can keep the faith with those who came before us. On that note, and being that today is Remembrance Day, it's November 11th, 2025, I feel it's only appropriate that we explore the life of a soldier who was Canadian and who met his end on November 11th, 1918. So let's start there. On the 11th of November 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns on the Western Front fell silent. 4 years of slaughter, mud, grief, and sacrifice finally came to a halt. But for one soldier, the war ended just minutes too late. His name was George Lawrence Price. He was a private in the Canadian Army, the CEF, and he died at 10:58 a.m., 2 minutes before the Armistice took effect. Yet his story echoes through time. So today, on Remembrance Day, we pause and we remember him. George Lawrence Price was born December 15, 1892 in Falmouth, Nova Scotia. He grew up in what is now Port Williams in King's Country. He was the third child of James and Annie Rose Price. As a young man, George moved west. He ended up in Saskatchewan on the prairies working as a farm laborer. In the echelons of life, he was typical of his generation, Canadian-born, rural-minded, looking for work and purpose. His decision to enlist didn't come at the outbreak of the war. It came a little later, as many did, after the drumbeat of conflict had rolled on. So on 15 October 1917, George Price enlisted in Regina, Saskatchewan. His service number, 256-265. His unit was the 28th Northwest Battalion, Canadian Infantry of the Saskatchewan Regiment. So a little later on, Private Price crosses from Southampton, England to Boulogne and arrives at Etaples on 2nd May 1918 to rejoin his unit on 1st of June 1918, where he serves in A Company. Private Price was gassed on the 8th of September in 1918 in the North Canal area, and he was sent to the 1st Canadian Casualty Clearing Station to be treated. After that, he was then sent to the 26th General Hospital in Etaples. He returns to his unit on 26 September 1918, and so this was late in the war. George wasn't a volunteer at the very beginning. He joined when Canada was deep into the conflict, when the cost was known and the call was still urgent, and by the time he joined, conscription was on the books. Training was tough. The 28th Battalion had been in action previously, and by the time George arrived, the 100 Days Offensive was underway. He would join the frontline service sooner than he perhaps expected. So by November 1918, the Canadian Corps was advancing rapidly towards the First World War's final objectives. 28th Battalion was assigned to the 6th Canadian Infantry Brigade, which was part of the 2nd Canadian Division. And their objective on the 11th of November 1918 was to advance from the Havre area toward Canal du Centre, secure the bridges in and around the village. This was in Belgium. So they moved early that morning. The war diary notes that at about 9 a.m. they reached positions along the canal facing the village and waited for orders. At that time, the message came. All hostilities would cease at 11 a.m. But the battalion held position, yet the men on the ground knew what still lay ahead. They were in the open, across from the houses where German snipers or machine gunners could be hidden. And in the last moments of the war, those hidden men still fired. So it's kind of no wonder that Price's battalion sort of felt the need to stick around, even though 11 o'clock was rapidly approaching. And the accounts vary slightly, but the core story remains consistent. So George Price, along with Private Arthur Barrett Goodmurphy and a small patrol of 5 men, decide to move out across the bridge and check the houses on the opposite canal bank. Sure enough, they found German soldiers mounting machine guns behind a brick wall overlooking the canal. And at the moment that their patrol was investigating, the Germans opened fire. George stepped out of a house into the street and was fatally shot on the right side of his chest by a sniper's bullet. The time of his death is recorded as 10:57 or 10:58 a.m., depending on who you ask. Either way, 2 or 3 minutes before the ceasefire at 11 a.m. One account reads that a young Belgian nurse ran across the street to tend to him. He was then pulled inside of a house and treated, but died quickly. George's circumstances of death card from his service record state the following. Killed in action whilst taking part in the advance northeast of Havre on the morning of November 11th, 1918, at 3 minutes to 11 o'clock, he was hit in the right breast by an enemy rifle bullet. Although every attention possible was given to him, he died shortly afterwards. So it might only have been minutes or less, but the war officially ended. In that sense, George Price shares a unique distinction. He is widely regarded as the last Canadian soldier killed in battle during the First World War, and possibly the last for the British Empire on the Western Front. Again, depends who you ask. So the war ended at 11 a.m., but the bullet that killed George arrived just 2 minutes earlier. George was initially buried at Havre Old Communal Cemetery. Later, his remains were moved to St. Symphorien Military Cemetery near Mons, Belgium. At St. Symphorien, he lies among many casualties of the final days of the war, and ironically, he rests near the grave of the very first British soldier killed in the war, so that the first and the last fall almost side by side. In Ville-sur-Haine, a memorial plaque was put up on 11th November 1968 at the location where George fell. In 1991, the footbridge across the canal was named the George Price Footbridge. In 2015, the local school was renamed École George Price. His British War Medal and Victory Medal were posthumously awarded and later donated to the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. So sometimes we kind of have to reflect a little bit. I mean, George is recognized for being the last Canadian to die in this awful war, and I think we should ask ourselves, especially as young people, why does this story matter? And I think it's because the moment matters. Some might say the war was already won by 6 o'clock in the morning. I mean, the papers in the train car had been signed. So why did his patrol cross the bridge? Could the shooting have been avoided? And the fact remains that the fighting continued until the last second. Many soldiers still died in the final minutes. George Price's death invites us to reflect on the interplay of timing, the sense of duty, and tragedy. He didn't serve for years and years only to drop at the final moment, but that's what happened. So his name stands as a symbol. The toll of war doesn't cease simply because the hour hand strikes at a certain time. So on Remembrance Day, we pause at 11 a.m. Across Canada and the Commonwealth, we stand silent. For George Price, those 2 minutes before the guns fell silent were final. So a bit more of a personal snapshot about George. He was born in rural Nova Scotia. He moved west as a young man, worked as a farm laborer, probably very dusty, tired, and hopeful, as a lot of young men were, into the early 1900s. So he enlisted not at the beginning of the battle, but near its end when others had fallen, and Canada's losses were pretty heavy at that point. He'd survived gas exposure and returned to fight in the 100 Days Offensive. So he carried a rifle towards one of the war's final engagements, knowing full well that the end was near, but still felt duty-bound. Dying moments before the war ended, his family, his village in Nova Scotia, and his country remember him, and will continue to do so. Today we stand silent, we raise our hands in the pause at 11 a.m., we place wreaths and honor the fallen. Today we honor Private George Lawrence Price. Not just him, his story of one of hundreds, thousands, millions, those who served, those who died, those whose names we may not all know, but whose sacrifice remains. George Price's death, just 2 minutes before the Armistice, reminds us of the cruel timing of war, how even in its final breaths, lives were still taken. His story stands as a symbol of sacrifice at the very edge of peace. And as we pause on Remembrance Day, we recall the words of Lawrence Binyon's For the Fallen. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them. Price's name is one among thousands, and his story is one among countless families touched by war. In Edmonton, Alberta, where I am now, the Adkins brothers, William, Martin, and George, answered the call together. Their journey through the Canadian Expeditionary Force reflects another side of remembrance, not the final soldier, but the shared burden carried by families, communities, and generations. As we move from the story of George Price to the Adkins brothers, we'll see how individual sacrifice and collective service intertwine. Each name a thread in Canada's tapestry of memory. Their lives remind us that remembrance is not only about one soldier, but about all who stood, fought, and endured. So now shifting gears a little bit here, focusing on some local history, specifically on the story of the Adkins brothers. The three of them were from a small farming community near Westlock in Alberta, about 45 minutes drive northwest of Edmonton. In the spring of 1915, Edmonton was a young city, living in two worlds at once. On one hand, it was booming. Stores and banks were rising on Jasper Avenue. The city's young streetcar system rattled its way through muddy streets. Farmers brought grain in from the countryside. Weddings, concerts, sporting clubs. Life went on, even while the war was pushing on. But in every newspaper, on every billboard, and in the windows of the recruiting offices, there was that other world entirely. The war. Canada had been fighting for almost a year. The great battles had begun, casualty lists grew longer every week, and Edmonton had decided to raise its own battalion, the 49th. That spring, in a small farming district near Westlock, three brothers heard the call, and their names were Martin, George, and William Adkins. This is their story, a testament to the incredible sacrifice asked of a single family on the Canadian prairies. So before they were soldiers, the Adkins brothers were farmers. The 1911 Canadian census records the family living in the Westlock area north of Edmonton. Their parents, Thomas and Mary, were immigrants from Oxfordshire, England. Like thousands of others, they had crossed the Atlantic hoping for land, stability, and a future for their children. Their sons worked beside them. Martin, the eldest, was steady and dependable. George, quieter, known to be a bit of a letter writer, and William, still a teenager then, was helping his father run the farm. Their life was dictated by the prairie rhythm, so planting, harvest, winter, repeat. No one in the family had a military tradition or connection. They were farmers, plain and simple. But when war broke out, patriotic meetings and recruiting speeches found their way into every church hall and grain elevator. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of bravery overseas. Lists of local boys already at the front grew longer each month. And by early 1915, the Adkins brothers had made their decision. They would go. In Edmonton, on the day of their enlistment, the three brothers stood side by side at the recruiting office of the 49th Battalion and joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. We know they stood together sharing this monumental moment because their regimental numbers were stamped in almost consecutive order. Private Martin Adkins was 32797. Private William Elijah Adkins, 32801. Private George Leslie Adkins, 33085. On each attestation paper, the entry for next of kin was the same: Mrs. Mary Adkins, Westlock, Alberta. 3 signatures, 1 address, and 1 mother who had just given 3 sons to the war. After training, they joined hundreds of young men from Edmonton and the surrounding districts boarding a transport ship in June of 1915. The papers described the emotional farewell. Crowds gathered at the rail yards, the bands played, and women waved handkerchiefs. Parents tried not to cry. The 49th Battalion sailed for England. England was often not the adventure that most men imagined. The battalion moved constantly from camp to camp, drilling, marching, cleaning equipment, waiting for the word that they'd be sent to the front. Fortunately for us, George was a prolific letter writer, and many of his letters survived. In one of his earliest, the tone was polite, almost cheerful, written clearly to reassure his parents. Quote, "We seem to always be on the move, but I expect we'll be settled soon." End quote. But the excitement of enlistment soon wore off. In another correspondence, his fatigue began to show. Quote, "There are forts everywhere here. They are short of soldiers, so they're taking as many men as they can get. I wish this thing was over and we were back." End quote. It was probably the most honest line on that page. On May 3rd, 1915, the Edmonton Journal newspaper reported a nominal roll of privates selected for reinforcements, overseas service. All 3 Adkins boys appeared on that list. Late in 1915, the brothers and their battalion finally crossed the Channel to France, and this is where the landscape and George's letters changed forever. Food was poor, mud was everywhere, the trenches were full of lice, rats, wounded men, and the reality of sustained modern combat became inescapable. In one letter from the line, he wrote, quote, "The fellows are getting killed all around us. The shells are awful when they get our range." End quote. In another, he offered what became his signature fragile reassurance to his parents. Quote, "We've had it pretty hot since we came from the trenches. We are all safe at present." End quote. It didn't mean they were safe. It simply meant I'm alive right now. Now, in the spring of 1916, the 49th Battalion was sent to the shattered woods southeast of Ypres, the area known as Sanctuary Wood and Hill 62. Another name for this particular battle is the Battle of Mont Sorel. It was one of the most ruthless corners of the Western Front. The artillery never stopped, trenches collapsed, and men were buried alive. On May 7th, 1916, Private William Elijah Adkins, the youngest son, was killed. The war diary for that day describes intense shell fire and trenches caving in. Given the chaotic nature of the fighting, William's remains were almost certainly destroyed or lost beneath the churned earth. So today he is commemorated on a special memorial at Sanctuary Wood Cemetery in Belgium, a white stone with his name marking a grave that no longer exists. And then a simple, devastating telegram arrived at the Adkins farmhouse in Westlock. Mary had lost her youngest son. About 1 month later, on the 5th of June, 1916, George Adkins wrote his mum, and it's evident that he is trying to reassure her that they're okay despite the loss of William. And we're fortunate to have a copy of this correspondence, and I'm going to read it to you now. So June 5th, 1916, George wrote, "Dear Mother, just a line to let you know that we are both all right, for which we must thank God, for we have been through a terrible ordeal. I don't know if I'm allowed to say much about it, but you will see by the papers what a fierce fight the Canadians have been into. How we, Mart and I, came through without a scratch, I cannot tell, as we've had terrible losses. It has been simply awful. I cannot describe it in words, but I know there has been nothing worse in this war. We did our 8 days in all right, and we were bombarded pretty heavy all the time, but didn't suffer much. Then we came out for a rest. The next night, they broke through and we had to go back. We had to make a charge in broad daylight, but they were ready for us and opened up an awful fire on us. We took what cover we could get in old trenches and were there all day. They opened up again 2 or 3 times in the night, but we kept them back. That night we were supposed to be relieved, but the relief could not get in, so we had another awful 24 hours, during which they sent over the terrible high explosives and shrapnel, but we held firm. 2 or 3 times they nearly landed one in our trench. The force of the explosion threw us down, and I couldn't hear nothing but ringing in my ears. I was hit on the back of the head about 4 times, but my steel helmet saved me. Then I had a bullet go right through a mess tin strapped on my back. I'm going to keep it as a souvenir. But I wasn't very frightened, although the strongest nerves couldn't stand it for long while the shells are bursting around and above. We had to stay in that trench for 8 hours without water and no food, but about 2 dry biscuits each. It was up to our shoe tops in water, and we got all stiffened and cramped up. We were thankful when the relief came at last. Of course, we had some very close shaves, but God must have been watching over us, and it made one think about that. The wounded were very brave and bore the pain and suffering like heroes, and some had ghastly wounds. I expect to be home soon now. Then I can give you a good account of it. We were so tired when we got home that we just fell down and slept for a long time. I will close now, as I'm pretty shaky today through nervous strain and loss of sleep, etc. We haven't seen, and then it's illegible, but we're trying to find them now. They suffered heavy too. I think we're out for a good rest now. Goodbye with love, George. 7 weeks later, June 27th, 1916, tragedy struck again. The 49th Battalion was still in the same lethal sector, still in Sanctuary Wood, still being pounded by shell fire day after day. Private Martin Adkins, the eldest brother, was killed in action. Unlike William, Martin's body was recovered. He was buried at Bedford House Cemetery, a quiet place surrounded by trees and open fields. The July 18th, 1916 issue of the Edmonton Bulletin newspaper, now defunct and replaced by the Edmonton Journal, stated on page 4, "Westlock man gives life." Private Martin Adkins, reported killed in action in today's casualty list, was a member of the 19th Alberta Dragoons when he enlisted in the 51st Battalion on January 15th, 1915. His next of kin is Mrs. J.A. Adkins, Astrop Farm, Westlock. The following are today reported killed in action. Private Martin Adkins, Edmonton, 49th Battalion. So 2 sons gone, 7 weeks apart. Imagine their mother, Mary, receiving a second telegram, its brief, formal words confirming the loss of her second son, Martin. The weight of that cumulative grief is almost unbearable to contemplate. George survived both bombardments. He kept moving forward with the battalion, not because he wanted to, but because now he was utterly alone, with no choice but duty. His correspondence changed again. It became shorter, less detailed, and more tired sounding. After Martin's death, George could offer no comfort, only shared sorrow and quiet resolve. He wrote home to his mother, quote, "I got your letter today. I am awful sorry. Keep up your courage." End quote. That was it. He could not describe the nightmare. He could not bring his brothers home. He simply told his mother to keep going. George Adkins fought in the trenches for more than 3 long years. He lived through the worst battles of the Canadian war experience. He survived the endless shelling at the Ypres salient, the Battle of the Somme, the brilliant, brutal triumph of Vimy Ridge, the quagmire of Passchendaele, and the ferocious final push of the 100 Days Offensive. The 49th was one of Canada's hardest fighting battalions, and George was there for all of it. He saw men from Westlock, Barrhead, and Edmonton die beside him. He saw trenches blown apart and rebuilt again and again. He breathed gas, walked through mud that swallowed horses, and carried stretchers through ruined fields where nothing grew. He was a farmer's son from Alberta, and all he ever wanted, written again and again in his surviving correspondence, was to go home. On November 11th, 1918, the guns stopped. George lived to see the end of the war. In April 1919, 4 years after he left Edmonton with his brothers, he stepped off the train and returned home. His discharge papers state that he was physically fit. They say nothing about grief or nightmares or what it meant to sit at the family table with 2 chairs forever empty. George married a woman named Louise. He farmed again, raised children, and lived a long life. People who knew him remembered him as quiet. And like most veterans, he rarely spoke about what he saw. But he kept his letters because even if he couldn't talk about the war, his correspondence told the truth. Today in Belgium, the sacrifice of the Adkins family is permanently etched into the landscape of memory. Martin lies beneath a white headstone in Bedford House Cemetery. William is remembered on a special memorial at Sanctuary Wood. And in Canada, George's quiet words survive in that fragile correspondence. We are all safe at present. I wish this thing was over and we were back. Keep up your courage. 3 brothers enlisted together, 2 never came home. 1 returned carrying the weight of all 3. Nearly 10 years on, George received a letter from an old comrade from the 49th Battalion. Einar William Anderson, 433069, had served with George and Martin on the Western Front. He was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, or DCM, on 28 March 1918. At the time, he had risen in rank to sergeant and was later promoted to lieutenant. He was invalidated out of service in May in 1919 and was, by 1928, living in New Jersey with his new bride. He sent this to George in August of 1928, which I will read in part. Dear George, you will never know how much I appreciated your letter of the 19th, just received, and I'm going to answer right away. It was like a breath of old time's sake, though in all truth, the old time to which you and I and a few others hark back as acquaintances in arms is not a happy one. I am enclosing herein the slip of paper given me by the clerk in the British War Graves Commission office in Ypres, and from which I found both the graves of Martin and Bill. The notation encircled has no reference to the graves, but it is merely a notation that I made at the time. You will remember endeavoring to locate Bellevue Spur, where you'll remember we caught hell in the year of grace, 1918, on Passchendaele. You will remember after the June 3rd scrap, I was corralled for the orderly room because of Sergeant Sharp, the orderly room sergeant, having been wounded. Well, if I remember it rightly, Mart was killed the next trip into that hellhole, which would be about the 18th of June, 1916, at a point, judging from where his body was found some 500 feet east of Maple Copse. I remember when his personal effects were taken from his body, we found a note which left so deep an impression on me that I have never forgotten it and never will, for I consider it one of the sublimest acts of heroism of which I have ever heard, of which one seldom hears except in the pages of romantic fiction. The words were written after he was wounded and in the brief period before he died. It said, "On the battlefields of Flanders, goodbye, mother, goodbye, all. Mart." George, I am deeply interested in knowing whether or not your mother ever received that note. It was handed in to the orderly room and carefully labeled with the rest of his effects, and after having been drawn to the attention of Colonel Griesbach, because of the high beauty of his last thought and act. What an act of sublime courage. I often think of it. It's one of the things that stands out in my memory as the most heroic, all that which came to my notice in that frightful massacre. End quote. So the Battle of Montserrat was typical of many small local actions in the Great War, but the cost was substantial. In less than 2 weeks, in June 1916, over 8,430 Canadian casualties, that's killed, missing, and wounded, between the 2nd and 14th of June. Amongst the dead and prisoners were 2 Canadian generals and 5 colonels. On both sides of the line, the bulk of the casualties came not from the initial infantry clashes, but from the weeks-long shelling that destroyed trenches, buried soldiers alive, and overwhelmed field hospitals. One unnamed officer wrote, quote, "Among the dead was Major General Malcolm Mercer. It would be bad enough to be killed in a fair fight, but we didn't relish being buried alive." End quote. This battle is also known as the Battle of Sanctuary Wood, and this is where George's brother Martin was killed, as mentioned in the letter I just read. The First World War is often told through numbers, millions enlisted, millions killed. But the story of the Adkins family reminds us that every number was a person, a home, a mother, a future interrupted. 3 boys left a Westlock farm. 2 are buried in Belgium. 1 returned and tried to build a normal life. Over a century later, their names are still carved in stone. Their letters are still read, and their story still matters. Thank you for joining me on Memory and Valour. If you'd like to explore the service records and the photos related to the Adkins family, you can find them on my website at www.memoryandvalour.ca, and that's Valour with an O-U-R. As we close today's chapter, let us remember that courage was not only found in the trenches. Behind the lines, another battle was being fought, one for survival. In rough Canadian field dressing stations, medics worked under fire to give first aid. Stretcher bearers carried the wounded across mud and shell-torn ground, often unarmed, risking their lives with every step. At casualty clearing stations, Canadian doctors and nurses performed surgery in makeshift theaters, pioneering techniques that would change medicine forever. Things like blood transfusions, antiseptics, portable x-rays, and more. So next time on Memory and Valour, we'll step into that world. The Canadian Army Medical Corps, the stretcher bearers who braved no man's land, and the field hospitals where compassion stood against chaos. Their story is one of endurance, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. And today, as we release this very first episode on November 11th, Remembrance Day, let us pause. Let us each take some time today to reflect on the lives given, the lives saved, and the lessons carried forward. For remembrance is not only about the past, it's about how we honor it in the present. So until then, keep history alive. For where memory endures, valor lives on, lest we forget.